Okay, so hopefully the sound and the lighting is okay. I'm going to try to keep it focused on the book. Sorry if the video isn't great, but that way, if you want to, when you're listening at home, you can follow along. All right, so Unit 1 is going over the nature and the history of psychology. The learning objectives are: after completing Unit 1, you should be able to describe and explain the definition and goal of psychology, discuss the history of psychology, discuss the different perspectives on behavior, discuss the scientific principles of psychology, discuss the different methods of research, and discuss the different specialties in psychology. All right, so it sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. It's just a general overview. So first, definition and goals of psychology. That's our objective number 1. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and the mind. So it's science that's specifically geared towards how we behave and how our mind works and thinks. The term behavior refers to actions and responses that we can directly observe, whereas the term mind refers to internal states and processes such as thoughts and feelings that cannot be seen and directly and that must be inferred from observable, measurable responses. Basically, it's invisible, so we just have to look and watch and then measure by that what we think the mind is trying to tell us. Just like they ask us, scale of 0 to 10, how depressed are you? That's a measurable response. Psychology began as an attempt to answer philosophical questions about human nature, using methods borrowed from physics, physiology, and other sciences. Psychology's systematic approach yields more accurate knowledge about behavior than do everyday casual observations and conventional folk wisdom, which have generated many misconceptions and myths about human nature. So that's essentially telling us that psychology developed as a science, but it uses other sciences in order to be able to explain certain behaviors and, of course, how the mind works. As a science, psychology has 4 central goals: description, explanation, control, and application. Description is the most basic goal. Psychologists seek to describe how people behave and think and feel. They want to be able to write it down and chart it. Explanation typically takes the form of hypotheses and theories which specify the causes of the behavior, as psychologists strive to explain and to understand why people act as they do. A hypothesis is just a guess. A theory is a guess that's proven to be right a few times, so they're starting to think they might have the right guess. Control is where psychologists design experiments or other types of research to test the accuracy of their proposed explanations. So they want to make sure, so the control is going to be kind of your base. It's going to be the immovable part of your experiment. And so that's like them saying, okay, Megan without drugs is the control. Now we're going to give her this drug, and that is the experiment. Application is where psychologists apply psychological knowledge in ways that enhance human welfare. So, application. They figure things out. They want to make things better. Science involves both basic research, which reflects the quest for knowledge for its own sake, and applied research, which focuses on solving practical problems. For psychologists, most research examines how and why people behave, think, and feel the way they do. All right, on to the history of psychology. Humans have long sought to understand themselves, and for ages, the mind-body problem has occupied the center of this quest. Many early philosophers held the position of mind and body dualism, the belief that the mind is a spiritual entity not subject to physical laws that govern the body. Dualism implies that no amount of research on the physical body, including the brain, could ever hope to unravel the mysteries of the non-physical mind. Another view is of monism, which holds that the mind and body are one, and the mind is not a separate spiritual entity. To monists, mental events correspond to physical in the brain. Monism helps set the stage for psychology because it implied that the mind could be studied by measuring physical processes within the brain. Discoveries in physiology, an area of biology that examines bodily function, and medicine help pave the way for psychology's emergence. Several major perspectives have shaped psychology's scientific growth. Okay, so dualism, basically mind and body are separate, meaning, which we know is probably not the case, meaning if you don't feed your body, it's not going to affect your mind. Well, that doesn't make much sense. So the monists are the ones that say the body and the mind work together. Structuralism and Wundt. The infant science of psychology emerged in 1879 when Wilhelm Wundt established the first experimental psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany. He believed that the mind could be studied by breaking it down into basic components, as a chemist might break down a complex chemical compound. This approach came to be known as structuralism, which is the analysis of the mind in terms of its basic elements. In their experiments, structuralists used the methods of introspection, which means looking within, to study sensations and report on one's own conscious thoughts and feelings, which they consider the basic elements of consciousness. Structuralism left an important mark by establishing a scientific tradition for studying cognitive processes. Okay, so they're breaking it down and they're journaling. They're writing down how they sense things and how they think about things and how the feelings are, and then they try to break them into different parts. Functionalism and James. In the United States, structuralism eventually gave way to functionalism, which held that psychology should study the functions of consciousness rather than its elements. Functionalism was influenced by Darwin's evolutionary theory, which stressed the importance of adaptation in helping organisms survive and reproduce in their environment. William James, a leader in the functionalist movement, taught courses in physiology and psychology at Harvard and University. So when you go and you start doing some more of your prereqs, you're going to take anatomy and you're going to take physiology. Anatomy is just going to be the simple listing of all the parts of the body. Physiology is going to be how those parts function and how they work together. So that's essentially what they're doing here with the mind. Structuralism is the anatomy, and functionalism is the physiology of psychology. Then we move on to Gestalt psychology. By the 1920s, German scientists had formed a school of thought known as Gestalt psychology, which examined how the mind organizes elements of experience into a unified or whole perception. They argued that the perceptions are organized so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Gestalt psychology stimulated interest in topics such as perception and problem solving. Okay, so essentially the Gestalt just takes the physiology or the functionalism up to a higher level, realizing that the mind is a lot more complex than, say, a wrench. A wrench has parts to its body and it has a function, but the mind has all of those things, yet it can do much more powerful things on top of that. Pavlov and classical conditioning. This guy's famous. You'll hear about him a lot. In the early 1900s, experiments by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov revealed how learning occurs when events are associated with one another. Pavlov found that dogs automatically learn to salivate when the sound of a new stimulus, such as a tone or a bell, if that stimulus was repeatedly paired with a known stimulus like food. This particular type of psychology examines how organisms learn through the consequences of their actions. Thus, learning is key to understanding how experience molds behavior. Watson, Skinner, and behaviorism is a different perspective. They have what's called the behavioral perspective, and it emphasizes how the external environment and learning shape behavior. Watson and Skinner believe that psychology should study only observable stimuli and responses, not unobservable mental processes. Behaviorism is a school of thought which emphasizes environmental control of behavior through learning. Behaviorists sought to discover laws that govern learning, and they believe that the same principles of learning applied to all organisms. Think about the experiments on rats where they would put them in a maze and put cheese at the end. They wanted to try different things. So what happens if you take out the cheese? What happens if you put in a piece of bread? They're looking strictly at the behavior. Skinner was leading 20th century behaviorist who believed that the real causes of behavior reside in the outer world. A person does not act upon the world acts upon him, meaning your environment is what dictates how you are, who you are, how you behave, how you think. Skinner believed that through social engineering, society could harness the power of the environment to change behavior in beneficial ways. His approach, known as radical behaviorism, was esteemed for its scientific contributions and for focusing attention on how environmental forces could be used to enhance human welfare. Now we come to Freud and the psychodynamic perspective. You'll hear about him a lot as well. The psychodynamic perspective searches for the causes of behavior within the inner workings of our personality, our unique patterns of traits, emotions, and motives, emphasizing the role of unconscious processes. Freud developed the first and most influential psychodynamic theory. Freud was convinced that an unconscious part of the mind profoundly influences behavior, and he developed a theory and form of psychotherapy called psychoanalysis, the analysis of internal and primary unconscious psychological forces. So psychodynamics and psychoanalysis, that's where you start to hear the stories about people sitting down on the couch and the doc with his notes, and somebody tells a story or they tell about a dream, and the doc starts to analyze it and try and figure out what it means to that specific person. Freud also proposed that humans have powerful inborn sexual and aggressive drives that, because these desires are punished in childhood, we learn to fear them and become anxious when we're aware of their presence. This leads us to develop defense mechanisms, which are psychological techniques that help us cope with anxiety and the pain of traumatic experiences. Repression, a primary defense mechanism, protects us by keeping unacceptable impulses, feelings, and memories in the unconscious depths of the mind. So that's like when you have a really traumatic experience and you'll hear the kid, something horrible happens to him and he just can't remember. That's what that was the theory, is that he's repressing it so far back in his subconscious mind that and that's a protective mechanism, that he can't remember it. All behavior, whether normal or abnormal, reflects a largely unconscious and inevitable conflict between the defenses and internal impulses. Humanistic psychology. Oops. All right, well, we're having technical difficulty here. Can't turn the page. Humanistic perspective emphasizes free will, personal growth, and the attempt to mean in one's existence. The humanistic perspective emphasizes personal freedom and choice, personal growth, and self-actualization. Abraham Maslow was a humanistic theory who proposed that each of us has an inborn force towards self-actualization, the reaching of one's individual potential. When people develop in supportive environment, their positive inner nature emerges. This particular one is actually really important to nursing. You'll hear a lot about Maslow's hierarchy. And what that is a fancy way of saying he drew out a pyramid that says somebody can't have the things at the top of the pyramid if they don't have the things at the bottom of the pyramid. And at the very bottom of the pyramid is things like food, water. Well, and then right above that would be love and safety. And he's saying that the human mind and the human condition, you're not going to seek out safety and love before you're going to seek out food. You have to have the food first, then you get the safety and love. And as you continue to get those things that are necessary to you, you climb up the pyramid. Biological perspective. The biological perspective examines how brain processes and other bodily functions regulate behavior and psychological characteristics. Behavioral neuroscientists study brain activity and hormonal influences. Behavior geneticists examine the role of heredity, and the evolutionary psychologists seek to explain how evolution has biologically predisposed modern humans towards ways of behaving. I don't have a lot of insight on that one for you. It's just saying that your body regulates how you think and how you act. Evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology seeks to explain how evolution shaped modern behavior. Evolutionary psychologists stress that human mental abilities and behavioral tendencies evolved along with a changing body. According to one theory, as our human-like ancestors developed new physical abilities, they began to use tools and weapons and live in social groups. In his theory of evolution, Darwin noted that within a species, some members possess specific traits to a greater extent than others. Through a process he called natural selection, if an inherited trait gives certain members an advantage over others, these members will be more likely to survive and pass these characteristics on to their offspring. In this way, species evolve as the presence of adaptive traits increases within the population over generations. Thus, through natural selection, adaptations to new environments contributed to the development of the brain, just as the brain growth contributed to the further development of human behavior. Okay, evolution, Darwin, you're going to hear a lot about it. Natural selection basically you'll hear another saying called survival of the fittest. That means that whoever has the best genes is going to survive the longest. Now, to use an example, those with Down syndrome. Well, you don't see a whole lot of people with Down syndrome, and if you had a whole population of Down syndrome people, they cannot, because of the way their genes are, they cannot repopulate. So eventually, they would all die off, and that's what natural selection means. It means if you don't have what it takes to survive in your environment, then eventually your species or your version is going to die off. The cognitive perspective. Cognitive perspective, embodied by the subfield of cognitive psychology, views humans as information processors who think, judge, and solve problems. Cognitive neuroscience examines brains that occur as people perform mental tasks. This perspective views the human as a thinker, studying a person's thoughts, anticipations, planning, perceptions, attention, and memory processes. The sociocultural perspective. The sociocultural perspective examines how the social environment and cultural learning influence our behavior and thoughts. Cultural psychologists study how culture is transmitted to members of society and examine similarities and differences among people from various cultures. This perspective studies the human as a social being embedded in a culture and assesses social forces, including norms, social interactions, and group processes in one's culture and social environment. All right, so this has got a whole lot to do with kind of it's not socioeconomics, or sociology, sorry. And it's saying that because of the culture that we live in, or whatever culture we grow up in, basically our core beliefs are developed as part of whatever that culture is, and that you can't separate one's culture from one's environment. All right, we're going to pause there.